Hi everyone, and welcome to another Alpha Chat. I'm here with Stephen Hubbard to discuss the upcoming legislation in New Zealand and also the guidance that's been issued in Australia around climate change risk. Stephen, thanks for joining us. A very interesting topic, and I guess as general introduction to it, what we're seeing is regulators and supervisors around the world developing responses to a data deficit, really, in climate change data.
That's right, James. Good to be with you again. And certainly regulators have been talking about this for some time. New Zealand was the first country to act, and there's, as you say, there's legislation sitting in Parliament as we speak around the disclosure of climate change financial risk. And here in Australia, just again 2 weeks ago, APRA released a guidance note, a draft guidance note, looking for submissions from the industry to talk about how they're going to look at reporting climate change financial risk.
Yeah, and what do you think, Stephen, the main differences are in terms of what we're seeing in New Zealand? Obviously, we've got legislation in New Zealand versus guidelines in Australia. What do you think the main differences between what's being proposed in either country are?
Yeah, I think first of all, starting with what's similar, and I think the key issue is that climate change is now being treated as another financial risk that needs to be disclosed by financial services organisations. And that's, I think, a really important step forward. In New Zealand, it's being done in terms of a legislative instrument. Here in Australia, we've already, APRA is the prudential supervisor for the financial services, and it does issue a lot of prudential standards on reporting of risks. And what they've done, rather than changing the prudential standards, they've issued a new guidance note on how to include climate change risk in with all the other risks that organisations have to monitor and, more importantly, disclose. And so it's not new legislation in Australia like it is in New Zealand, but the impacts will be similar.
Right, and I see for New Zealand, the timing for investment managers, we're looking at draft legislation going through Parliament right now. And in terms of the rollout, the impact on investment managers having to look at climate risk as part of their mandate across investments, we're looking at 2023. How does that work in the guidelines that have been issued in Australia?
So in Australia, it's been a slow process, like I guess similarly, in lots of places, getting changes to legislation and regulations does take time. APRA first talked about this about 4 or 5 years ago, and has been slowly evolving its thinking. 12 months ago, it issued a letter to financial institutions talking about the guidance it's proposing. And as I said, just a couple of weeks ago, it released draft guidance. So it's taking submissions from the industry. It has been delayed due to COVID. They did sort of pause it a bit. So we expect probably a similar sort of time frame to New Zealand, depending on the response from the industry. One of the things that APRA has said when they put out the draft guidance notes a couple of weeks ago, one of the reasons they've done it is that the industry's been asking for the guidance to make sure there's some standard ways that financial risks of climate change are being reported. Of
course. Yeah, it's really important to get that framework in place, isn't it? So that everybody knows exactly how they're going to be reporting this. And what we're talking about here is far beyond ESG. We're now talking about taking into account climate risk as part of your risk strategy as a whole new risk category, aren't we? Alongside things like credit risk.
That's right. And so it's not just part of your investment thesis, but it's something that the risk management teams are going to have to work out how they include in their risk management frameworks. And APRA's gone to quite a bit of detail on talking about the types of risks. So one of the things APRA's flagged is that the impact of climate risk on other risks like liquidity or credit risk. So, if you're investing in organisations or lending to organisations, you need to understand their own climate risk. And they've also looked at physical risks, so rising sea levels, changes in natural disasters, those sorts of things. They've talked about transition risk, because as policies change, organisations are going to have to adapt. And companies, organizations around the world are looking at net zero. What does that mean for their planning process? And so there's a transition, and what are the risks emerging from that transition? And APRA's also flagged liability risks, and that's especially for insurers doing underwriting claims. Both New Zealand and Australia, we've seen some pretty significant natural disasters in the last few years, many of them exacerbated by climate change. So it's very important from an underwriting point of view that insurance companies understand the impacts of climate change on their financial risks. And to your point about sort of ESG, I think the key differences are ESG is part of the investment process, whereas now climate change needs to be part of everything an organisation does, from risk management through to financial disclosures in annual statements.
Absolutely. Yeah, and then the next part of that, Stephen, I guess following on is from a data perspective. We're talking about here, of course, risk management relies completely on good data, and we're talking about here a whole complete set of additional or new data to assess climate change risk for investment managers, aren't we?
That's right. And one of the things that APRA's talked about, and I'm sure it'll be also part of the New Zealand legislation, is organisations need to do scenario planning. Here in Australia, APRA's actually recommended a couple of scenarios about different degrees of temperature rises, and understanding what impact that might have on your business. And that requires data. And it requires a different type of data that financial services companies are used to collecting.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think to get to net zero in 2050, which is the goal in both New Zealand and Australia, it's an absolutely key step on that journey. To have all the investment managers, insurers in New Zealand, it's anybody who's managing more than $1 billion, or the top 200 roughly listed companies and listed issuers across the stock exchanges, who are having to adhere to this guidance. I think it's an absolutely necessary step on that goal towards net zero by 2050.
Absolutely. And here in Australia, it covers banks, insurers, and superannuation funds, and anybody managing large amounts of investments. Yep.
Okay. Well, thanks for your time, Stephen. Good to learn a bit more about how this new legislation and new guidelines is going to impact investment managers over the next few years.
Thanks very much, James, and we'll talk again soon.
Cheers.